Okay, dear friends and colleagues, thank you for showing up for this somewhat different get-together, which I'm sure everybody wanted to be a face-to-face meeting, but which of course now is not. And thanks to Alex, who has tirelessly struggled to make this thing happen in the first place against pretty formidable odds, I have to say. Now, over the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to take you through some of the more linguistic aspects of the theme of this symposium, namely words that bind, that is to say, the expression of compulsion in earlier, that is to say, Old and Middle Egyptian language. I'll mostly be looking at different kinds of expressions and forms that there existed for conveying such meanings, but I'll deliberately leave out some bigger, although related issues, such as causation and such like, things that have been studied pretty extensively elsewhere. And I won't be taking any particularly logical view to the issue either, but rather just try to conduct a survey of the ways in which earlier Egyptian expressed things that you could interpret as linguistic compulsion. Now, the linguistic expression of compulsion belongs to the class of phenomena grouped together as modality, which together with tense and aspect represents one of the three pretty central semantic fields in language. Expression of compulsion is more particularly an inherent part of what's traditionally called a deontic modality. Which is all about expressing degrees of the language user's will. So it's concerned with obligation, permission, and related things. You must eat your greens, you should drink less, and so on and so forth. These sorts of expressions, in terms of their illocutionary force, they communicate the volition of the speaker in one way or another. And when that's directed towards somebody, particularly someone else of the speaker itself, that pretty much equals compulsion. Now that's the notional side of things, but linguistics comes to the picture when one starts looking at the level and ways in which these notions are grammaticalised, that is to say, linguistically coded in a given language. That is of typological interest, and it's also of interest from the point of view of synchrony and diachrony of individual languages. There's two central categories involved in this. Deontic modality and grammaticalisation of that stuff is usually based either on modal systems or indeed mood. Modal systems are systems where these kind of notions are pretty much expressed by means of modal auxiliaries and lexical means. So English is a very good example. Whereas mood is inflectional. You've got things like subjunctive and indicative moods. So grammatical forms. I've given you an example there of fula. That's a Western African language that has a pretty flexible subjunctive mood used for all sorts of things that are modal in character, but nothing is usually either or in language, of course, and languages characteristically mix these two coding strategies. So Spanish, for instance, has a fantastically flexible subjunctive inflection for a wide variety of modal nuances, but then it also uses auxiliaries alongside and in tandem with the subjunctive. But neither Spanish subjunctive or English auxiliaries, of course, are specialized or marked for the expression of deontic modality only, even if they are modally marked forms generally. That means then that you can use these things for various other types of modality than just deontic. So here you can see how English must and may can be used for epistemic modality, which has to do with knowledge and belief and that sort of stuff. In Spanish, the subjunctive is used for all sorts of things beyond that, so uncertainty and presupposed and whatnot. That's not so simple. So one has to look at not only whether one language has as inflectional or other ways of expressing compulsion, but also does it have forms specialized just for that? And if somebody wonders what's surströmming, that's a Swedish delicacy. Now, Where should we then place earlier Egyptian on this typological map of grammatical expression of compulsion and deontic modality? Well, this language did have at least one special, or let's say marked, inflected modal verb form used to express such meanings, and that was the subjunctive sejm f. Now, those of you who have taken a look at what Egyptological linguists are saying about the sejm formation, they might have despaired that, well, you know, this is just absolutely confusing, ever more complicated morphological and phonological ideas are being added, and one might justly feel that, well, clarity is being sacrificed for theoretical finesse. But I have some good news about the subjunctive, because it has, well, it is reasonably certain now that this is indeed, or was indeed, a morphologically regular form of sejm f that was inflected in the same way of all verbal roots in the earlier Egyptian lexicon, and one also that was associated with a single definable semantic pragmatic function, namely that of non-assertion. Now, non-assertion encompasses all kinds of subjective or non-indicative notions, and one of these was the expression of various types of compulsive deontic meanings. Now, here you have three examples of exactly that. These all express some sorts of obligations towards interlocutors and so on. And, you know, they are clearly expressions of compulsion in that sense. But of course, that's not all of it, because, well, the subjunctive here is, of course, in each case, an initial subjunctive. But we know that the same form was also used in many other non-indicative environments, such as, well, in final clauses, in so that clauses, that is to say, as in number 4, or in initial wishes, or as in 5, or in, in various complement environments, like in the causative construction, ready plus subjunctive, and so on and so forth. And these are uses that do not express any compulsive illocutionary force. Necessarily, although 5 is still sort of deontic, but it's not particularly compulsive. So what we have in the subjunctive, in other words, is that we have a generalized non-assertive verb form that indeed resembles the subjunctive of Romance languages, for example, quite a lot. The deontic and compulsive nuances of this form are a function of a certain, that is to say, initial syntactic use, but they're only one part of its complete functional profile, which covers, in fact, all sorts of non-assertive speech act types. So the compulsive meaning was not a marked feature of the earlier Egyptian subjunctive, even if the form itself can be said to have been marked for modality in a more wider sense. And by the way, if one wonders what the marker was in this form, it was, I'm actually referring to the phonological structure of this form, which is the sort of characteristic stress on the final syllable that is typical. So here we have a generalized modal form that could be used to express compulsive meaning, but it wasn't marked only for that, of course. And we can probably say something similar also of another sejm f monster, namely the geminating sejm f, the mereref form, although here we are actually on much less safe ground. Well, in initial use, the geminating sejm f2 may be sometimes interpreted as expressing injunctions and obligations, like in 7 and 8. You can see that these are very well or easily interpreted as injunctions. But this was not always so. If you look at number 9, for instance, that irerek there is clearly not, the king is not laying an obligation to Cayenne Tenet in any way. So the meaning here is probably just a kind of contextual implication that could, in appropriate circumstances, sort of pop up. For instance, when it was a second person who was being addressed, and the issue was that of a non-realized state of affairs. But I mean, this was something that we don't quite know why this happens, because with the initial subjunctive, for instance, it's easy to understand why the deontic meaning appears, because this is part of the form's generally non-assertive profile. So in appropriate circumstances, this happens. But by contrast with the geminating sediment, there are serious problems in trying to pin down even the illocutionary or modal character of the geminating form. And we don't even know whether this was inflected of all root classes. So that is actually quite a bit of a problem. But it has always been that, of course. This form is a real pain in the neck. So perhaps it's better to move on from here and say that, well, besides the subjunctive, there was another form in this language that was regularly used to communicate compulsive meaning. And that, of course, was the imperative. That is only used to give orders. And, well, all its uses are simply addressed to second person, and they are orders, compulsive utterances, of course. And this being so, one might well think, well, okay, fine. This is probably something that is a marked feature of this form, because, you know, the function is so obvious. But that wasn't in fact the case at all, as it doesn't tend to be the case in languages generally. Yes, there are some exotic languages that integrate the imperative fully in their modal systems, but usually the imperative is in fact completely unmarked in languages. Think of English: go, hear, eat, die, whatever. It's actually formally nothing but the shortest form of the word root. And when you look at these examples of the earlier Egyptian imperative, you can see that it's actually the same thing. The imperative is nothing but the shortest form of the root, in fact. It doesn't carry any concatenative or other type of inflection that could be identified as specific to it. So therefore, it doesn't really have any kind of marking for function. Okay, sometimes you get plural imperatives, of course, but that is person marking and is not very common. In late Egyptian, the imperative seems to have developed a certain degree of independent inflectional traits in the form of that I prefix, which crops up in quite a few verbs that survive then in Coptic as well, as you can see there, as these irregular R initial forms. But this thing was pretty short-lived, and it never really generalized across the whole lexicon. And it's similarly unclear what the occasional pretty same-looking prefixes found in the pyramid texts imperatives actually represents. But they're wide and far apart, and certainly not a paradigm-defining morphological feature. So if you want to wrap the whole thing up, you can say that, well, the earlier Egyptian imperative is and was almost devoid of inflection. It was a form used to express compulsion, and nothing but compulsion, but it was not associated with a function-specific morphological marking of any kind, in fact. Other non-lexical things expressive of compulsion in earlier Egyptian are mostly pretty embryonic, synchronically pre-grammaticalised things. The most interesting here, I suppose, is the future UFR sejam. Now, it has many names, but the term asserted future tries to sort of capture the idea that this thing is really used in an earlier Egyptian, primarily for firm statements, asserted statements of fact about things to come, as opposed to the subjunctive, of course. Now, these examples here are, of course, very classical and typical of that. But already in the Old Kingdom, and increasingly so in the First Intermediate period, we begin to see uses that are much less like this in character. And the best attested of these are in the so-called appeal to the living. Now, the pivotal point of the appeal to the living is the request made by the deceased to those reading the text that they should either, recite the offering formula on behalf of the deceased or give some sort of an offering to them. Usually this request is made in the subjunctive sejam F, as in number 6, jed 10, may you say, and 1,000 bread and beer, and what have you. But already in the sort of late 6th dynasty sources and thereafter, instances begin to crop up where the ufr sedgem is used instead. And there you go, in 17, just as you decide to be favored by some god, blah, 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 uten eredit any, you shall give me bread and beer. All of a sudden use that form instead of the subjunctive. Now, I don't think that the person behind example 17 actually wanted to say as an objective fact that the visitors to the tomb are going to recite the formula. No, instead the ufr sedgem here clearly is used to express a nuance that is quite similar to the subjunctive in the usual formulation. I'm not saying that it's exactly the same, but it's probably very close. And to perhaps get an even closer look, what it probably meant is when we look a little bit wider, because around the same time as this kind of examples start to crop up, the same construction is also found in the continuation of the appeal to the living, where the deceased is first asking the visitors to make this offering, and then if they don't happen to have anything in their hands, then they should recite with their mouths. And in 18, you have a classical case of that. If there's nothing in your hands, jet, chen, and raten, then say with your mouth. Normally, as here, it's the subjunctive sedgem f, jet, chen. But sometimes, if you look at 19, you see exactly the same phrasing, except that they use the u, chen, er, jet. You are to say, you shall say. Again, I think this is not really an objective statement. It could well mean that, if there is nothing in your hands, then you just must say something with your mouths, in as much as you have brought nothing. So a compulsion is being expressed here. You are forced to do that. You must do that because there's nothing in your hands. And that might well be what actually is meant by this choice of the form. Because later on, of course, the ufr sedgem goes through a process of grammaticalisation. It becomes, finally, in Coptic, very much later, the so-called third future, or the optative, as it is sometimes called. Now, this still carries some sort of assertive sense as well, but it's very much used to exactly this sort of compulsing meaning, as in 20 and 21. You shall honor your father and mother. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and so on and so forth. So it's become this kind of, optative. And well, the early examples that we just saw from earlier Egyptian, I think they are kind of harbingers of this meaning. So the meaning is, it has to start somewhere, and I think those weird examples that seem to be compulsive is actually sort of anticipating this use. It had to start somewhere. I think it might have been there. But of course, in most of earlier Egyptian, ufr sedgem is still very much an assertive future. So those deontically modal meanings that we saw are very early indeed, and they're far and wide apart. Another construction that we might mention at this point is the imi sedgem n, the hortative one, which begins to appear in sort of early New Kingdom in what seems to be colloquial style or something like that. Now this, of course, is built of the imperative imi, of the causative ready, and then the subjunctive sedgem n. Very close to the English let's do something construction. Later on, this is grammaticalised into the Coptic maref sortem, injunctive construction, of which I've given you an example there in 23. But the early Egyptian examples are still very, very early. As you can see, the sedgem F in this construction hasn't yet been replaced by the analytic pattern Irief sedgem, which actually lies at the root of the Coptic maref sortem. This, in fact, happens only in rather late demotic. So what we have here in earlier Egyptian is something very, very early, at an early stage. It's not a grammaticalized pattern of expressing compulsion, and it's certainly not an inflectional pattern at all, as Coptic maref sortem later was to be. And that is pretty much all that there is to say about earlier Egyptian means of expressing affirmative compulsion. So there's no inflectional form specifically marked for deontic modality, even if there is at least one generally marked modal form. There is an unmarked imperative and a handful of things that have not yet developed into anything particularly grammaticalized for the purpose of expressing compulsion. What's really strange about this language is that they don't seem to have possessed any affirmative lexical expressions of obligation either. So, I mean, words like may and must and shall and things like that, they just aren't there. So, you know, the inventory or the grammatical oeuvre for the expression of compulsion seems rather unexciting in earlier Egyptian, if we are absolutely honest. But that, in fact, holds only insofar we talk about the affirmative. When we go to the negative side of things, there's something rather more interesting to be found. And the one thing that I think is really very exciting is the negative auxiliary, imi. Now, formally, this thing has very limited range of forms. It crops up in the suffix conjugation form, imi, imi-ek, imi-f, whatever, and as in 24, and then it appears as the imperative m. In classical Middle Egyptian, this thing has already become very much an auxiliary, and we may even follow its development in reaching this stage. If you look at 26, you can see something rather strange. In pyramid text, you find this M looks like an imperative, and then followed by a sejm F. So em chateb ek, do not pity. That's an unusual construction. And it looks like, you know, it was a subject complement to a negative verb. And then, you know, this became grammaticalized so that the sejm F lost its inflection, which was transferred to the negative verb, which became a real auxiliary. And the erstwhile sejm F became the so-called negatival complement. It's quite nice to see these things because it actually seems to be a grammaticalization in process. And what happened then is that, well, you can't put anything between those two, the auxiliary or the negatival complement, because they actually have merged into one word, one prosodic unit. And in fact, the negatival complement appears to be aclitic. You know this, of course, from the fact that, well, if you have a noun subject to imi, it has to go after the negatival complement, as it does in 28. But if you have a personal pronoun subject, it is suffixed directly to the auxiliary, as in 27. This is the old rule, which everybody knows, but it tells a lot about the sort of phronology and the level of grammaticalization of this thing. What's interesting, however, is, of course, the illocutionary properties of this. Negative auxiliaries are not that rare in worse languages, but I have to say I've never seen another one that would be exclusively reserved for the expression of deontic modality and therefore compulsion. But that is precisely what imi does. You shouldn't, you don't, you shouldn't, you whatever, you know, all these things that it means is must, should, may not, and do not here, and that sort of stuff. That is the associated meaning of this auxiliary and nothing else. So it clearly is a specific negative auxiliary reserved for the expression of deontic modality and therefore compulsion. Quite a rare beast. I as I said, have no parallels to present to you here. So this language therefore possessed a marked negative auxiliary for deontic modality. That, of course, gives you reason to expect that there's going to be a lot of other things on the negative side of things that might be similar. But in fact, there is nothing particularly exciting to be found beyond this thing, except for some lexical means, which are quite nice. And of course, they are a refreshing novelty compared to the affirmative. So here we have, for instance, the verb sao, don't let or beware lest, which was used to give warnings and denials of permission, sort of quite compulsive sense in that too. So here's one example. But I think the more interesting one here is the verb wedge, order. Because when this is negated, it appears to have been used to express the meaning something is forbidden or something must not happen. If you look at these examples, it makes no sense to translate them as denials that something was ordered or is being ordered. So the sun god speaking in 13:1 surely didn't mean that, well, that he had not ordered mankind to do evil. And then in the locus classicus, the 32 from Papyrus Westcar, Jeji's point is definitely not that, you know, decapitating humans hasn't been ordered. No, the idea seems to be quite clearly that it's not allowed, it must not happen, which you might take as an expression of compulsion, of course. So to sum up this overview of the expressions of compulsion in earlier Egyptian, the level of specialized grammaticalization of such thing is relatively low at this stage. Things are pretty much content reliant, they are subsumed under bigger things, except for a couple of really exceptional things like the deontic negative auxiliary imi. And lexical means of conveying such meanings are also pretty infrequent. But things were to get better over time. Well, the language, as we saw, grammaticalized a modal optative out of the earlier pattern assertive future UFO sedgen, and then an injunctive out of the construction imi sedgeman. And in Coptic, when we reach that stage, there are also various lexical expressions, some of them even loan words like the anange from Greek in number 33, all of which mean something like must and have to and compulsion and that sort of stuff. So, you know, these things are on the increase. So the later language is richer in what pertains to special modal grammatical forms in general and deontic patterns in particular. But earlier Egyptian still, the expression of compulsion is still largely a matter of, you know, context and discourse pragmatics rather than grammaticalized juxtaposition of formal patterns. And that's where I would like to call it a halt. And thank you very much for your interest. And yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.